The Maccabees project, now in its third year, is a joint project of Boston University and Boston College. And it is an experiment in interdisciplinary dialogue and research. Our goal is to meld diverse perspectives and so improve understanding of the world that the Maccabees and their fellow Judeans lived in and wrote about. And I must say that it's always a little bit of an uphill climb, this interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary thing, but tonight's program, I think, will push the envelope as far as we have ever tried to push it in one place and time. Our focus this evening is the period and place of Jonathan Maccabee, the youngest brother of Judah. He's the famous one. So that is Palestine and Judea in the 2nd century BCE, the middle of the 2nd century BCE. We have two categories of evidence, and you should be holding one of those categories of evidence in your hand right now, chapters 9 through 12 of the book of 1st Maccabees. And the second category of evidence that we have is archaeological remains. These two categories are like two people who have just met and are not really sure they can be friends. On the one hand, the archaeological remains are, first of all, mostly new. The text is very old. Once you have some information, when you get new information, you are psychologically primed to ignore it. You're psychologically primed to dispense with the new because you're already content with the subject matter of the old. So that's one kind of tension. The other is that the archaeological evidence reveals places and people and episodes that don't appear at all in the text. And then, to complicate matters, our ancient author wrote at least a half a generation, and probably more like a full generation, and possibly even more than that, after the events that he was describing in these particular chapters. So you can just try to put yourself into that position. It would be as if things that happened in your childhood, your children would write about. They might not get it all. And of course, our ancient author was writing, as all authors will do, for a certain audience with a certain point of view and a certain agenda. Like our ancient author, I too have an agenda. My agenda is to try to understand what was happening in the middle of the 2nd century BCE in Judea. And the second part of my agenda is I want to know how to use this text, these chapters of this book, to help me understand that. Now, on my own, I can account for the archaeological evidence, and I'll be doing that shortly, but to help with the second piece of my agenda puzzle, we've brought in some heavy hitters who are sitting here with us tonight. Steve Weitzman here, the Abraham M. Ellis. By the time I do this 3 times, I'm going to be able to just the Abraham M. Ellis Professor of Hebrew and Semitic Languages and Literatures, and the Ella Daravoff Director of the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and a specialist in Hebrew Bible and Jewish culture, and Benedict Eckert, who is an ancient historian who holds a postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of Bremen, Germany. This morning, Steve and Benedict led an international group of participants, some in person and some via video link, through a discussion of some novelistic and possibly fictitious aspects in 1st Maccabees, and led us all in a conversation of what the interpretive consequences of such an approach might be. And tonight, they have very graciously agreed to be guinea pigs in this experiment of trying to encourage friendly relations between a slew of disparate archaeological remains and the smooth historical narrative that is 1st Maccabees 9 through 12. So here's how it's going to go. First up will be me. You can watch on the screen. I will be spending about 15, 20 minutes. I'll try not to talk too fast, but just fast enough, although if I lose you, wave your hands or yell out at me. And I will go over Not every single piece of recent archaeological evidence that's pertinent to the question, but hopefully the most salient ones. And then Stephen Benedict will have some few minutes to respond. We're not going to give them a ton of time to respond because a lot of the response has to come from your response to this. So this is designed to be, intended to be, not only interdisciplinary, but interactive. And for that to happen, you have to talk as well. So get a drink of water, wet your whistle, and be ready for that. My favorite way to describe scholarship is that it is at heart a conversation, and that's what I hope we'll have tonight. So let me get started here. The book of Maccabees is a hero story, and it's a hero story that has a number of heroes, the most famous of which, of course, is Judah Maccabee, and its heroic qualities, the qualities that make it so compelling, have not dimmed over the ages. You are admiring here on the screen a stamp issued by the State of Israel in 1961, which was part of its Heroes of Ancient Israel series. There are a few others in the story. And like a lot of hero stories, it's very tightly focused. It's tightly focused on a certain family, a certain place, a certain time, to the exclusion of a lot of other peoples that must have been living in the vicinity. We just barely hear about them, however. And one of those groups of peoples who I think is very pertinent to the story, or should I say the non-story, of First Maccabees, and very increasingly well elaborated in the archaeological evidence, are the people who come from the ancient Phoenician city of Tyre, the Tyrians. First Maccabees talks about the 2nd century BC, and it's written probably towards the end of the 2nd century BC, but you see on the screen here that I've got 5th and 4th century BCE, and that's because the archaeological evidence that we're going to be looking at, and I think the backstory that is pertinent to what is missing and maybe misleading in the text, starts here. Now, most of you are well aware that this is a period that looms large in Jewish history because it's the period of the return from Babylon. It's the period when Judeans were repatriated back to their homeland. They were allowed to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. We are told more and more families came back. We have the saga in various books, but especially in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. It has taken archaeological evidence of the last decade or so to show us that they were not the only ones who were repatriated back to their homeland. The Tyrians were also repatriated after the Persians conquered Babylon, and in the conquering of that city, they found a lot of peoples who had been displaced. The Judeans weren't the only ones. So another one of these groups of peoples who had been displaced was the Tyrians, and they allowed the Tyrians to move back to their homeland. To give you a sense of how the archaeological evidence reveals what's happening here, the area of Judea, which we can see reflected in the archaeological remains, the area that the Judeans were allowed back into and that they settled, is about the size of the blue circle that you see here on this map, and the red circle is the area that was given over to the Tyrians. And for those of you that are a little discombobulated by the map, you're looking in a direction that you don't normally look at when you look at this landscape, because you're looking south. So that's the Mediterranean along here, and Egypt would be right about here, off the screen. Syria here, and moving up north along the coast. So you are north in this rendering, and I like this because it kind of messes with your sensibility, which I always think is a good thing when you're starting out with archaeology, mess with your sensibility. So how is it that we know that the Tyrians had such a big area that they were repatriated? We know it from archaeological evidence, and the first site that I'll show you is Mitzpeh Yamim, and you see it located here on the map at the very, very corner of that red oval. And the reason that it's located at the very, very corner is because it was, in fact, an outpost, a sort of border outpost of the city-state of Tyre. How do we know? Because we have the archaeological evidence from the site. So Mitzpe Yamim is the highest point in this section of Lower Galilee. From it, you can see both the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean. So it's a very strategic and very well situated spot. And you are in the view here on the left, standing on the top of Mitzpe Yamim and looking north. And you see that the vista is very fine. And there was a big watchtower, border tower, and you can see the rocky remains, the foundations of that big border tower there. And also up here on this height was a small sanctuary. It was a small shrine. And in the shrine were found by archaeologists a lot of dedicatory objects, including some very fancy bronze things, some with inscription in Aramaic to Phoenician deity, but the most telling were about 100 very poor, small ceramic oil flasks, perfume bottles, each one of which was an individual dedication by somebody, and every single one of which came from Tyre. The clay has been analyzed. We know that it came from Tyre. And this is a little bit remarkable because it's quite the schlep up to the top of Mitzpe Yamim. First you have to get all the way inland, and then you have to get all the way up. And yet, people will have acquired these, or merchants will have sold them to them. And so this 100 so dedicatory objects found at the site lets us know that the people who frequented it, who came here, were Tyrians, were people from Tyre. All along the eastern edge of that red oval, we have sites with remains from the 5th and the 4th century BCE that are connected with Tyre. And that, along with some other evidence that I'm not going to bother you with, is the reason for this great big red oval on this map. That's the reason that we can recreate the historical episode of the Persian king, allowing the Tyrians this expanse of land, which probably just like the Judeans, they regarded as their ancestral home. It wasn't just simply geopolitically convenient. It was probably part and parcel of what they thought it was important for their own history. So the last piece, the last spot on this map is the site of Kedesh, and you see an aerial view here in the lower left of a 20,000 square foot administrative building that we spent about 9 seasons excavating, beginning in 1999? Yeah, 1999. And this is a building, this large building was built first in the 5th century BC. It was built at the time of this repatriation from Babylon. And inside the building, we found evidence that allows us to not only identify who the occupants were, who the people were who ran it, but the kind of thing that they ran it for, what they did there. What did they do there? They collected, and probably also redistributed, agricultural commodities, probably directly back to Tyre. So it was an agricultural outpost that was run by, if not the royal house of Tyre itself, so Tyre at this point had a king, there was a royal family, so if not the royal house of Tyre, then some set of elites or well-connected people working on behalf of that house. And we have found some small little emblems that let us know of their political affiliations. So you see here a couple of glass seals with that would have made impressions, one of the Persian king, one of the Tyrian god Melkart, and then this beautiful tiny green jasper scarab. It's very small, it's maybe just the size of in the palm of my hand. You could have worn it as an amulet around your neck, and on the bottom of it is carved the face, probably of a Tyrian noble person or elite person. So it turns out that in the period of the return, in the 5th and the 4th centuries BCE, at the time that the Judeans were holding on to their repatriated territory around Jerusalem, the Tyrians also had an enormous chunk of land. This geopolitical reality must have bothered some Judean writers. I say that because in what I take traditionally to be the date of the Book of Chronicles, which is the Persian period, although Benedict may have something to say about this later, but in the Book of Chronicles, we find many, many instances of episodes, especially episodes between Judah, Jerusalem, and Tyre, rewritten. So I just give you one example. In the Book of Kings, which of course is originally set in the time of the Empire of David and Solomon, the map of which he imagined, this is a map that's based on the size of the kingdom according to the Book of Kings, which has poor correlates in the archaeological remains. But anyway, in the literary testimony, this is the way that the folks who have returned from Babylon would have imagined this was the territory that they lost. In that, it says in 1 Kings 9, 10 through 14, at the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the two houses, he, Solomon, gave to Hiram, he was the king of Tyre, 20 cities in the land of Galilee. In other words, Solomon had to hand over a whole bunch of territory. The comparable text, the parallel text in 2 Chronicles simply 100% reverses the story. At the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the house of the Lord and his own house, so the temple and his palace, Solomon rebuilt the cities which Huram, that's who the chronicler calls Hiram, had given to him and settled the people of Israel in them. So I point this out to you for especially the students in the room who might not know, you cannot actually believe every single thing that you read in these biblical books. If you do, you have to hold two things that are opposing right next to each other. Now, I speak not as a source critic or a biblical scholar, but simply as an archaeologist, and I just say, I find that to be very interesting, very interesting. And it makes me wonder about the flexibility of other authors of antiquity, including that of Maccabees. And just before we move to that period, I have this beautiful quote from Mark Smith, Memoirs of God, great book that I recommend, especially to students because it's very well written. Exile generated Israel's most far-reaching changes in redefining its identity. Production of texts served a revolutionary role in negotiating and expressing those changes. The texts became the landscape of the places lost in exile. They captured in words what was lost in time. Texts, in other words, are a kind of a strategy for dealing with a world, especially a strategy for dealing with the world if that world is not organized in the way that you think it ought to be. Narratives, writing of history can help you settle these things on parchment or scrolls or paper in ways that the real world might not be working out. So let's move on. Same region, different political overlay at the time. Now in the 2nd century BCE, this is the time of the Maccabees, there's a new pharaoh in Egypt, there's a new ruler over the land, that's the Seleucid Empire. But underneath the imperial overlay of the Seleucids, the same peoples are there with the same sense of their history and the same sense of what they're owed. And among those peoples are the Tyrians and the Judeans. Kadesh remains an imperial stronghold. For 300 years now, it has remained an imperial distribution center for agricultural commodities. It's been refurbished a little bit, but it's still completely in operation. It's this enormous complex, 20,000 square feet. You get a sense of scale from the few people that are standing here towards the bottom end of it. There were beautifully painted, or you might not love the taste that they had here, but anyway, they were painted reception rooms with mosaic floors and frescoed walls, and there were in the southern part of the building great big plastered bins for the collection of agricultural commodities. These commodities must have been amassed and then distributed out towards back towards the coast. And you see some of these plastered bins here. There were storerooms where some of these agricultural commodities were held onto before they were redistributed. And you see here one of those storerooms. There were 20 jars the size of me. I like to say I am small for a person, but I'm an excellent size for a jar. This jar, that is a sizable jar. So these jars are about just a shade over 5 feet tall. And you see one of our students excavating sitting in front of them. So they were found lining the walls. They held wheat, which we know because we did residue analysis on the bottoms of them. They held wheat. Inside the building, we found lots and lots and lots of pottery, much of which comes from Tyre. So connections with the coast that had been part and parcel of the way things worked up here in the Persian period were maintained. They continued. And these vessels, some of them were containers. You see some very large jars here. They were containers, but a lot of them were vessels like table vessels, for example, or lamps, things that were brought in for themselves. So the traffic back and forth between the coast, especially Tyre, and the interior was substantial. Inside this large compound in the Seleucid period, there was an archive, it was a records office. And we found 2,000 clay ceilings. That was spectacular, let me tell you. And most of them just had pictures on them, and they were probably private, but some of them were official and imperial. And you see some of those here, and I just want to draw your attention especially to this one, which is very interesting. So you see on the left some Seleucid imperial ceilings, Antiochus III, Antiochus IV, the Seleucid anchor is the symbol of the royal house, a civic ceiling here, but the one that I put the circle around is a local provincial official. He identifies himself as he who is over the land, so some kind of, not probably governor, but something, some provincial level organizer, and he identifies in and as a Phoenician. He writes in Phoenician, Ashal Arts, and the symbol on the seal is Tanit, the Phoenician lunar deity Tanit. This is not Iron Age. This is not 900 BCE. This is 150 BCE. This is a very, very purposeful self-identification of somebody connecting with a deep past in this region. And we have about 15 of these ceilings. So either this official was based here, or a lot of the material that he stamped was needed to be put here. Kadesh is not the only Seleucid imperial compound in this vicinity in the middle of the 2nd century, in the early to middle of 2nd century BC. A little bit further south, right around the area where Mitzpayamim was, is another big site. Hirbit El Ika is a new excavation undertaken by Hebrew University. And Ika was a big fortified site, and you see some of the walls here, so you see the plateau of it here. And they too, although they were very far inland, had very regular commerce and mercantile relations with the coast. So inside these buildings were found lots and lots and lots of imported Aegean wine amphoras. And you see a whole bunch of them stacked up here. These things were heavy. They're large, they're bulky, when they're full, they're heavy. And you do not find them in small villages. You do find them in Seleucid imperial places. So it seems that there were a number of Seleucid footholds up in the interior, up here of the Galilee. And it also seems that although in this era, Tyre is no longer a monarchy, it's not an independent entity, it's a city-state under the Seleucids, Our little ceiling from the Kaddish archive, he who is over the land, suggests that the Tyrians still have some sway in this area. The mercantile connections are still very strong, and the royal house might have disappeared, but the elites of the city will not have disappeared. There will have still been that social sphere, and some of them may have gone to work for the Seleucids, and some of those people may have been the provincial officials who worked at Kaddish. A very strange thing happens in around 144, 143 BC. It's very unusual to be able to date something so specifically in antiquity. Usually we give these broad ranges, but all those amphoras, all those great big wine jars that I showed you, they have handles that are stamped, and we can date the stamps. It's some great trick that archaeologists have. Yes, you should be very impressed. I don't do this kind of thing. It's like somebody who's an ancient bookkeeper who can keep track of this kind of thing, not me. But the people who do this, they can date the stamps to the year because the stamps name officials. And in the year 144, 143, a whole slew of sites, including big important sites, including fortified sites, are suddenly abandoned. They're abandoned altogether, all at the same time. That includes Kaddish and Ika up in the north. It includes the site that you see down here on the outskirts of the Shvela Judean border, Mazor, which also was a big farmstead. They had a whole bunch of imported amphoras there. 144, 143, story over. Everything just stops at that point. These years, we know from numismatic evidence, from the evidence of coins, were confusing for the Seleucids. Just not to go into a whole bunch of detail about them, but there were a lot of fights. Nobody could decide who should be king. There were two big contenders, and they were fighting, they were duking it out up and down the Levantine coast. So one of them was a fellow named Demetrius I, another was a guy named Tryphon. They both minted coins. We can tell what cities they held onto by where their coins come from. So Tryphon held Antioch and Byblos and Akko and Dor and Ashkelon, and Demetrius held Cilicia and Tyre and Shiraz-Kar. So and you can see this is not a recipe for stability. This is problematic. And this went on for quite a few years, this intense maneuvering and this intense fighting. This is exactly the time when all of those sites, Kaddish and Ika and Mazor and a couple of others, are abandoned. But the thing that's really odd is that these two guys keep on fighting, and none of those sites are reoccupied. Nobody moves back into them, even though they're very, very large. There's a considerable architectural investment in them. There's a lot of, they're fortified, they have a lot of capacity, and yet nobody, and they've been occupied for decades, or in the case of Kaddish, centuries, and nobody comes in. Something else really strange, unique, actually happens at Kaddish, specifically. In this exact period when Demetrius and Tryphon are fighting, and right after the abandonment of the site. And here's what happens. Somebody comes to the back to the building. The building's been abandoned. Somebody comes back to the building. They block the door of the archive room. You see the blockage here on the upper right. It's kind of strange looking. Doesn't really stop you from getting in, but it clearly makes a line that you would have to step over. And then towards the back wall, a child is buried. Probably a very newly born child is buried, and you see the skeleton inside a semicircle of rocks. When we were excavating this room, we went through very, very hard-packed mud brick. It was so hard-packed it had kind of petrified. It had kind of petrified because it had burned. And it burned because the room had been set on fire. How do we know that the room had been set on fire? We found roofing nails, those nails that you see with a 90-degree turn are roofing nails, you know. Do this. We actually had a carpenter with us at the time that we found these, and he identified them right away. It was a little funny. These is you nail something through a beam, and then the bottom of the nail sticks out, and you whack the top up so that it's flush with the beam. I don't know, in case somebody's on a ladder and you don't want them to hit their head and get tetanus. So nails like this are roofing nails. The nails came from the wooden beams of the room. The wooden beams caught on fire. They fell in. The mud brick, the superstructure of the walls, the mud brick came in with it. The roofing nails embedded in the mud brick burned. Even the walls, the stone at the inside of the walls cracked, and you can see the cracks on the right-hand side there of the wall. That's how hot the fire was inside this room. Here's the thing. How do we know that this wasn't connected with the battle? How do we know that this wasn't connected with the Maccabees, if we think that it was the Maccabees who were up there? Because of this evidence. In one corner of the room were a whole bunch of flasks, about 40. We know they held oil, because we did residue analysis on them. Actually, they held a kind of oil called cedar oil, which is good for preserving papyrus. Which makes sense, because the room is an archive. The flasks held oil, but they're not burned. Now that's pretty strange, because you have a fire in a room that's so hot that cracked rock. Surely it would have burned oil flasks, but it doesn't. It doesn't burn oil flasks, and the reason, I think, is because some amount of time had gone by between the abandonment of the building and the flasks falling on the ground and the oil leaching out and evaporating away. Some dust and windblown soil comes in, covers them, and somebody comes back. Somebody comes back. Essentially sacrifices a child in this room and sets it on fire, ensuring that at least the archive can be used again, ensuring that it's polluted. Who could this be? One possibility are the Phoenician officials who had been working under the Seleucids and who saw a moment of weakness. We can tell that the Seleucids cannot have been as strong as we might have thought they were, because none of the Seleucid forces come back to occupy any of these fortified sites that they've been using for the last half a century. That's new archaeological evidence that we have for the period that is written about in the text that you have, and that we're going to ask Stephen and Benedict to talk about here a little bit. And just to give you a extremely fast, like 10-second overview of the part of the story in what I call it Jonathan saga, it's all Jonathan and nobody else. Nobody else is talked about as a contender for the interests of the Seleucids, and Jonathan himself is a kind of one-man military power show. He is courted and feted by all of the great monarchs of the day, Ptolemy VI, Alexander Balas, and then in turn Demetrius and Tryphon. They compete for his affection and his loyalty and his attention. Jonathan, in the text as you have it, ranges far and wide throughout this territory, all the way as far as the inner Mesopotamia, outer Syria, Antioch, Hamath, Akko, cities on the coast, and Kedesh, where it is said that he defeats a Seleucid force and kills 3,000 before he returns to Jerusalem. At this time, in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, this is the size of Judea. I don't think that the story that we have maps very well on the archaeological evidence that we have. And the question that I am going to pose to Stephen and Benedict is, can they be reconciled? can they fit one on top of the other, and if so, how? Because what it feels to me like is that there are major players in this story, especially the Tyrians, and their history has been co-opted and turned into Judean history for the purposes of the author of First Maccabees, who is writing maybe around this time, around 125 BC, so about a generation after the events that I just described. What's happening at this time that would inspire the author of First Maccabees to be writing a story like this? Well, one thing that's happening is that Judeans are moving up into the Galilee. They're not only moving into the lower Galilee, and Judeans are minting coins. They've just started minting coins, these small, really small bronzes are the first coins that they have started to mint. They mint them around this time. There some small groups of Judeans are moving up to the Galilee, and there are even a few moving to the upper Galilee, including to the site of Kadesh, where around 125 BCE, we have a kind of squatter settlement moving back into the large building. They take some of the jars from the storeroom, you see an upside down jar there, and they turn them into ovens. They build ovens inside the rooms, they block up hallways, they make like little, sort of little shanty land inside this 20,000 square foot administrative building. They don't occupy the whole thing, they occupy parts of it. These are clearly not administrators, and they're clearly not Tyrians. They have nothing to do with anybody on the coast, and all of their material culture is more similar to that from the sites in the lower Galilee than Judean sites. That, I think, is the context in which the hero story of Jonathan is constructed. A story that makes sense not so much of the time that it describes, but very, very good emotional, psychological, and legendary sense for the time in which it's written. When the people for whom it's written are moving exactly up into this territory that was long claimed and held by another group of people, and territory that they want to believe is rightly theirs. I rest my case and ask the both of you to rip it apart. I don't know which one.
Maybe I'll go first. So hello everybody, I'm Steve Weitzman, and I see there are a lot of students in the room, so maybe I'm going to pitch my comments at the students and try to put this in a larger context, more to raise some questions for us to talk about than to raise specific objections, anything that you suggested just now. What Professor Berlin was showing us by using the archaeology to question the account of events that we have in First Maccabees illustrates why archaeology is so disturbing for not just historians but for other people, because archaeology has this tendency to complicate things and to take history that we think we understand and show us that we really don't understand it, and that things happen in a very different way than maybe many of us were taught. So the classic example of this is biblical archaeology. So biblical archaeology starts in the late 19th century, really picks up steam in the early 20th century, and what motivated a lot of biblical archaeology in its initial decades was the belief that archaeology was going to corroborate what was in the Bible. It was going to prove to us that there was a King Solomon and tell us about the nature of his kingdom and prove to us other events that we knew about from the Bible that people assumed was historical. And archaeologists went into the field, and initially they made discoveries that did seem to corroborate the biblical account. They found structures that they thought were built by Solomon. And they found other things that seemed consistent with the historical biblical accounts that we had. But then as archaeology developed and its methodologies were refined and archaeologists became professionalized and got in touch with archaeologists in other fields and other parts of the world, things began to unravel. And the buildings that were attributed to Solomon, it turned out they were from a later historical period. And events that we thought were historical, like the Exodus from Egypt, turned out to have no archaeological basis, and in fact were in some ways inconsistent with the evidence that we have from other sources. And even the idea that the Israelites were a people who came into the land of Canaan at a certain point and conquered the inhabitants and settled the land, even that basic idea was thrown into question as archaeologists discovered that the Israelites probably, based on the material culture, probably developed from within Canaanite culture. They were an indigenous people who for some reason thought of themselves as coming from somewhere else, right? So in other words, archaeology, by the time you get to the second half of the 20th century, archaeology is basically undermining the biblical account. And everything that people thought was historical, biblical history, it wasn't meshing with the archaeological evidence. So this created a problem for people in America, religious people obviously, but even secular people, this was disturbing. In Israel, for example, the modern state of Israel, is based on the idea that the Jews are returning to a homeland, they're reconnecting with biblical ancestors. Archaeology was a national pastime because it was thought to be recovering the ancient history of the people of Israel. And then these archaeologists came, including many Israeli archaeologists, and they said, no, what you thought was history, King David, King Solomon, that stuff didn't happen. And so it was very destabilizing for people's sense of identity and their sense of what the past was and how they connected to the past. So that's biblical archaeology. So now we have Professor Boleyn, right? And she's a cutting-edge archaeologist. I really hope you appreciate how lucky you are to have Professor Boleyn as a faculty member at Boston University, because she's really a leader in the field. And she's finding evidence that's now calling into question not the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, but now First Maccabees. Because what she just described to you suggests that history happened very differently than First Maccabees describes it. And I don't know if this has kind of made its way out there into popular culture yet or anything like that, but this too will disturb people, I think especially in Israel. I got a taste of this myself because a couple years ago I published a little article, very obscure article in a journal, and it was basically also calling into question First Maccabees and its account of the Maccabean revolt. And I didn't actually expect anybody to read it because it was like buried in a journal. But there was this one journalist who worked for Haaretz, and he was doing a special story on like new research on Hanukkah. And he found out about this article, and he interviewed me, and I was kind of impressed. He seemed to know what he was talking about, so I cooperated with him. And then he publishes this, it was the only thing I've ever done that's made a front page of a newspaper. He publishes this front page story in Haaretz, which is this Israeli daily, saying that I was like denying that Hanukkah was a real holiday or something. I love Hanukkah. But I made an argument that it wasn't a real thing. So for the first and only time in my life, once that story got out there in Haaretz, I got hate mail from people, right? From Israelis who had all these other foundation stories of theirs challenged. And here is another foundation story, the story of the Maccabees, which are really important in Israel. There's Maccabean games. There's, a beer named after the Maccabees. The Maccabees are really important in Israel. And here's some guy in America calling that story into question too. And so even though these people, I think, that sent the hate mail, they were not religious people, but I was calling into question yet another foundation story of the Jewish people. And so it's really upsetting people. So now you're doing the same thing with the archaeology. And with
I'm not talking to any journalists.
Yeah, be careful with journalists. And the advantage that archaeology has over a text person like myself is everybody in the world out there, not everybody, but a lot of people see archaeology as very scientific, right? So if archaeology says it must be the truth, right? I'm not saying that's an accurate representation of archaeology. That's how a lot of people perceive archaeology. So now there's much more forceful evidence coming out that suggests that what we thought we understood about this period of time, the Maccabees, the story behind Hanukkah, maybe it's not what really happened. So I guess the question I want to put out there is, whether that makes a difference to you, that you're challenging a story that means something for people, that is meaningful for them, that there's a whole holiday based on it, whether that has any impact on how you think about your work at all. And then the second question is, what do the rest of us do when some story that we care about, whether it's a biblical story, or Maccabees, or the American Revolution, whatever story it might be, what happens if that turns out to be different from what we thought it was? How does that change how we think about ourselves and how we think about the past? So, because there's so many students in this room, I wanted to put those big questions out there, and then maybe in the conversation we can talk in more detail.
But of course, so thank you very much, Steve, but one of the points I take from your response is you might kind of believe my story.
So,
believe some aspects of my story, and I just and you may or may not, but I'm pretty sure that Benedict doesn't believe my story. So I'm going to give him a chance to say how it can all be made all right, and then we could.
Yeah. Okay. Can you start this presentation? I don't know.
Oh, I can.
Yeah, because I didn't want to be the one without any images.
Yeah, it's so unfair, the archaeologists.
Yeah, it is unfair. They can, historians are always at a disadvantage. So I should explain first maybe that I really want both Maccabees and archaeology to be good friends, as you said at the beginning, because I have published articles that kind of presuppose that you can do something with First Maccabees, although it is a propagandistic text. And of course it is. I mean, you said it correctly, of course, and no one doubts that. This is a later text. It is written with, we talked about the term propaganda earlier this morning. I think it is applicable, right? It is a propagandistic text written from a later perspective. But still, there can be good in it. And I wanted to start with this picture to clarify first the methodology that you apply, because I take your statement on Kaddish now from my historical perspective as a commentary on chapter 11, verse 73 or 72. You know, it's a very, very small text that you have now elucidated. This is a very famous picture, I think, even outside Germany. A Russian soldier on the Reichstag on 2nd of May. Before the capitulation. Actually, this is a restaging of the event. You know, the original one was on 30th of April. There are a couple of other well-known changes. This is the official one. So they added the smoke and so on. And actually, they what you don't see here because it's too small. The soldier down there. This one he has two watches, one on each hand, and this one only has one. They put one away not to make him look greedy. So yeah, this is a nice propaganda picture that is very well known. And one thing that makes it interesting is that it is manipulated history, of course. Yeah, although the basic facts are still true. Our appreciation for it changes a bit when we know that this one is a fake image, right? The other one is, I think, you only understand this when you know a lot of details. If you try it as a simple narrative, you could write it like First Maccabees does, and they went to Berlin to the Reichstag and they encamped there, but then you don't understand it. You would have to add the italics here, and they went to the enemy's capital city, the last resort of a regime of terror, to the place where Hitler became chancellor, and they brought the war back to where it came from after 26 million of our people have died. And then you understand the picture properly, I think, and before that you don't. So I take Andrea to see something similar, of course not in these dimensions, in the Kaddish thing, right? If you don't know these things, you don't know what to focus on, right? You can focus on a man on a building high up, right? On the flag, right? You don't have the criteria to distinguish the important from the unimportant things, and you don't find the subtlety that may be connected to it. Now, Kaddish in First Maccabees, they returned to him and joined him, that's Jonathan, in the pursuit as far as Kadesh to their camp, and there they encamped. Or in the translation that you have there, it's very similar. It is a bit more accurate because it replicates this as far as, right? This heos. But that is not uncommon in First Maccabees. That is not something that where we would say it is already a detail. That is all the text says, right? I think Andrea wants it to be understood as they returned to him and pursued them with him as far as Kadesh in Galilee. That's right, our Galilee. As far as the place the enemy preposterously defined as his camp in our Galilee. And they even stayed there to show whose territory this is and always has been. And of course,
that's what I wanted.
yeah, and of course this is possible. I'm not saying this is not possible. It is possible with the picture as well. And in fact, it has to be done to understand the picture. So now my question to this is, do we have to do this? Because that would then, of course, not only be an important insight, but yeah, I think it is also a precondition for your theory. Now, supporting you, of course, would be Josephus, who does understand it like that, I think. Josephus I'm sure you know, is a much later author, writing around 90 CE, and he uses First Maccabees as a source, and when he comes to this passage, he adds the part in parentheses. So, Jonathan hears that Demetrius has a great army at Kadesh, and then he says, this city lies between the land of Tyre and Galilee, for they supposed that they could draw him off from Syria to Galilee as an ally of the later country, and that he would not suffer the Galileans who were of his own people to be attacked by the enemy. That's not in the source, and there is no good reason to think that Josephus, for this particular part, used a different source, which is what some people have claimed, like Etienne Naudet, for example. It is just, Josephus knows that this is Jewish territory, or at least he knows that it is at his time, and then he just projects it. So this is how a text looks like that is anachronistic, as you say, the First Maccabees is. Now,
I love that.
yeah, the Josephus, if we just had the Josephus version, yeah. But the problem is, of course, we do have the source, and the question is now, does First Maccabees really raise problems here? I think what you don't properly take into account in your story is that First Maccabees never claims that Jonathan controls Galilee. It is, in fact, very clear from the whole text that Jonathan is there in his capacity as a Seleucid administrator. He is the one who is over the land, so to say, from the Judean perspective, and he gets this position from a Seleucid king. Not from this one, but from the other one. And actually that changes a couple of times. So we are in a situation of throne war. There are several pretenders claiming that this is their territory, all of this. Tyre, Galilee, Jerusalem, they don't distinguish several Seleucid empires there. They just say, I'm the Seleucid king, and the other one says, I'm the Seleucid king, and of course they have their appointments to make. And so in the beginning of this passage leading up to Kadesh, in First Maccabees, you have this nice text. In 1159, if you look at that on the text that you just got, Jonathan receives his office, right? In this case, from Antiochus VI, who is but a little boy, so it's actually Tryphon who does that. And then it is said, Jonathan went out and crossed over beyond the river and among the cities. The whole force of Syria gathered to him in alliance, and he came to Ascalon. Now, this is immediately after he just got his office as general of Antiochus VI. So he goes to the Phoenician coast to see whether he gets troops or whatever. He has troops there. I mean, the whole force of Syria, admittedly, that is of course an exaggeration, right? But it seems that he has troops that he would not normally have if he was not a Seleucid administrator. Then the question, of course, here is, for example, which river does he cross, right, from Jerusalem to Ascalon? And so this is not commented upon here. The older translations assume that it is actually a technical term, that Perantu Potamu means the Seleucid administrative region, the Transeuphratan in the Abe translation. So all of this would then be his job to do. And so when he hears that Demetrius assembles troops at Kadesh, of course he goes there. But that doesn't mean he controls the territory. If you put up a map on the places that are mentioned in these 9 to 12 chapters that are actually controlled by Jonathan or Simon, who is also a Seleucid appointee at that point, and the places where he just goes because he is a philos, a friend, or a general of the king, then you get this, I think, very obvious picture that the area where it is said that he made fortifications there, so that he really controls, is the purple one. And the other places, some of which you just showed, are places where he just comes and immediately leaves again, because it is his job. So I would say it just fits very nicely that it is said in 144-43 he came to Kadesh and he immediately left. And what we see is that is the year apparently when Kadesh is abandoned, and that no one else comes there again. Yeah, there is not just Jonathan. There are other people coming around there, and so maybe it is just not very. It is not worth the effort. Always building up again some sort of administration when you know there is some Seleucid general running around, and maybe you have to leave again. We know, for example, this is Posidonius of Apamea, about the same time, after Tryphon of Apamea seized the Syrian throne, that maybe 1 year later, depending on whether or not that already presupposes that he killed Antiochus, the young one, there you have Demetrius' general, Sarpedon, who attacks him near the city of Ptolemais. And Sarpedon is defeated and he retreats. Ace 10 Mesogaian, so including interior. So where would that be from? That is also that region somehow, where he just I don't know, has the ability to retreat, because no one controls that region at that moment. It is just not possible to control it anymore. No, there were several people running around who all have their appointments, and this is not only plausible, but it is exactly what First Maccabees says. So my point against you is that control is something very different from what First Maccabees presents, but I think you presuppose control. Should we stand up to debate with you or with the people?
So one thing, even for the students in the room, you will have been able to glean that one way that you could think about the responses, these two responses, is the investment that each has in the source, in the story. If you want to hold on to this source, and as Steve said, hold on to the essential point of the story, you will be sympathetic to the and it's not the only way to think about it, but it's one way to think about it. That is, my point really is that you can stand in different places and then you can proceed along different lines. This was a lot of information, a lot of technical information especially. And it seems to me that one thing that could work here is for people to take a couple minutes, just a couple minutes, and turn to the person next to you. Just turn to the person next to you and think of a question or a point that either you don't get or you want to make before you just start asking random questions. That is, cogitate a little bit out loud to the person sitting next to you. So should we converse together? As in the literal meaning, converse? Converse together. We might have some questions for specific people, and we might have some comments. You can say what you want. Oh, okay. And I'm going to start with Adam, because I know that he has a question.
So my question is specifically about the dead child in Kadesh. How do we know it was a sacrifice? And it's just I'm kind of like curious about all the details about the situation the child was deposited there, how, why, I don't know, it just seemed dying in the fire. It's not really an important question.
What do you learn from the child?
That is one of the, maybe the most mysterious and unclear finds that we have. So I will tell you what I think, but it's just based on algorithms we found. Why is it not a burial? You know, as in just somebody happens to use that spot to bury. Because the room is set on fire on purpose. And because the door is blocked up. So both of those things are strange. Also, the room is a special room. It's an archive room. Also, people didn't get buried inside buildings when the buildings were in use. When people still knew that the building was there. People are buried in cemeteries. Surely we don't have the cemetery of this site, of this settlement at this time. But the cemetery is not inside the building. So the burial can't be just a burial. It doesn't look like an accident because the fire is not an accident. How do I know the fire is not an accident? Because it's the only room that's set on fire. That was detail I didn't tell you, so you couldn't know that. So the fire is purposefully set, and only that room is caught on fire. When I give a longer version of this lecture and I show the wall that has the cracked stone, that's between the storeroom where all the big jars are that are the same size as me, and the side of the wall that faces onto the storeroom, the stones aren't cracked. So the fire is very contained. It's very, very hot, but it's very, very specific. So the whole thing is a very, very specific event. And with such a specific event, I don't think it's an accident, and I don't think it's casual, and I don't, So the word sacrifice is very loaded. I probably shouldn't use it.
Especially since the Phoenicians have a reputation for child sacrifice.
Well, that's why I do use it. Because I want to set up the association of people. That it's true. I mean, yes. Why would it be such? We don't have any analogies for it, so I can't know that. Paul has a theory about that. Paul Cosman, who teaches on the classics department at Tufts River, Harvard, and has thought quite a bit about the burial in the archive room.
I mean, I've got a crazy speculation rather than
Build on.
It's at about the same time in various parts of the Seleucid Empire, almost precisely the same years. In fact, we know of 3 archives which get destroyed, which get burned. One of them is just burn, and you burn an archive for a number of reasons. Primarily, we think we burn an archive because it contains records of the debts that you owe. So if you destroy the records, then no one can say that you owe 3 talents the farmer down the road. But in really the main Seleucid capital in Babylonian called Seleucia on the Tigris, there's an archive where, in addition to it being burnt, the dates in the seal impressions have been gouged out, which is unnecessary if you just want to destroy the document. It's like an extra form of violence, and I think it's clearly quite marked. And then we've got Kadesh, where the only room to be destroyed is the one which holds the documents. And again, we're not just burning the documents, we're going far beyond that. Mm-hmm. So, bury a child, maybe kill a child, lock up the room, and burn it. I think archives, especially in the Seleucid Empire, represent something more than just information gathering. I think they represent really the Seleucid cosmology, the idea of time, and that what you're doing is sort of unworking that, polluting that. I think there's also the possibility that, as we heard, if the Phoenicians have a reputation for child sacrifice, we know that during the Maccabean Wars, or at least retrospectively, but I think also at the time, that the Judeans, when they fight against the empire, they recreate or present themselves as recreated forms of violence associated with their deep antiquity. Are the Phoenicians doing the same? If it is Tyrians, are they doing something which represents in older Phoenician practice? Right? So I wonder if it's antiquarian violence.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, the whole antiquarian thing is interesting because it's an era when there's lots of evidence of attention to local pasts. Judah, Maccabee, I mean, you know. Right. And the Tanit on the ceiling, I mean, that Phoenician ceiling. How do we know, just to answer the last part of your question, Adam, the timing. The building is abandoned 144, 143. Those oil flasks fall down at some point. Either, Gideon, what do you want to say?
No, I just have a question afterwards. I just have a question afterwards.
Oh, okay. The oil flasks fall down at some point. The shelves break or somebody tosses them down. But some amount of time has to go by for the oil to completely evaporate. I don't know, a year. I mean, the whole seasonal pass through. Winter rains, hot summer sun, everything that would make it so that when somebody does come back and set that room on fire, there's no oil left in the flasks. But it can't be that much time, just because they can just walk right into the building, block up that one. I mean, so if the superstructure of the walls are mud brick and people have abandoned it, and it's abandoned for a number of winters, some of the walls will have caved in. But that didn't happen yet. So I figure a couple of years, a year to 3, something like that. No less, probably not more. Gideon.
When I was reading Josephus, they commented that Simon was a diplomat to the Roman Empire and sought out the Jewish community there around the same time as 144. Yet, he also commented that Simon/Jonathan also acted as a general for the Seleucids. Would you argue that this is a discrepancy in the text, or do you think it just adds another layer that Simon was both a general to the Seleucids and a diplomat to the Romans?
That is a great question. Simon is, so this sounds like a complete evasion, but Simon is a little out of my purview because by the time of Simon in the text, I don't have anything on the ground that I can say this looks like the geopolitical setup. But Benedict has something to say about Simon, I think.
I mean, we don't have to, because Jonathan also supposedly sent to Rome, right? So we have the same, if it is a contradiction, it is also already there for Jonathan, so we can also stay a bit more on topic. Simon, of course, is different in any way because they claim independence for him, at least after 140. They date their documents after Simon in Judea. They have a big assembly, and the decision is made that he should become the high priest. But even that decision still mentions Demetrius II. And it states that the actual appointment was made by him. And yet you also have the show of independence in mind. So apparently both was possible for a while at the same time. And this must have happened more often in the region. We know that many, especially after 129, after Antiochus VII failed Parthian campaign, several dynasties make themselves independent, but they keep some Seleucid traces sometimes.
You know, the thing that's complicated to me about this is there's a long backstory for the Maccabees, all the way down to the time very close to at the end of it, is probably more or less current events. Current events are probably kind of true. I mean, people were around right then. The very, very beginning really might not. Mattathias, for example. This morning, if you would have been with us this morning, you would have heard people say, he's made up. I hope that could be a story that you are holding on to. But anyway, so it can be, in other words, that there's a point that's made up, there's a point that's true, and then, of course, the question is, well, as you go along that continuum, where's the
switch?
Yeah, but there
is
are
the cutoff all the way at the beginning? Is the cutoff? So for me, because of some of the other evidence that Benedict talked about, I don't really have such a problem with Simon. And for me, when I look at the complications and all of this additional, all these additional players on the ground, exactly at the time of Jonathan, I wonder, gosh, I don't know how much to believe about Jonathan. So Benedict's point is, if you believe this about Simon, it's parallel with Jonathan, so they hold some of the same offices. But you could say that about Jonathan anyway, I suppose. So
what would be your response to the fact that there is no territorial control mentioned here apart from this very small part of Judea that you mentioned? So, because part of your argument was based on Judea is so small, but they run around everywhere. Is it not plausible that you have your base somewhere like Tyre, that you have a sphere of action that extends?
it's possible. Yes, I think it's very possible that somebody could have a range, but I don't see any evidence that Jonathan would have had the capability of it. That's my, and I see all sorts of other people in the way. I see other entities in the way, who also had lots of territory control. Are you stretching, or are you gonna, Jonathan?
I just wanted to also just wrestle with the term sacrifice. I suppose you may have evidence of a murder, though I still don't understand why it's not an evidence just of cremation of a child.
It's not cremation. It's not a cremation. It's a corpse. It's a burial.
It's a burial. Oh, the fire is on top.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Even so when you're out, so you have a burial, you have a murder, right? This doesn't look like in Phoenicians, yeah, there's all sorts of evidence of child sacrifice. None of it looks like this. Like, I think we know a child sacrifice, like people excavated it, Incas or wherever it is, and in Carthage, they don't look like this. So even when you use that word sacrifice, right, obviously it's electric, it gets people excited, but it's also violating your own rules, right? I mean, if you're really trying to get out of the imposition narratives, right, or something like that.
I'm not necessarily trying to get out of the imposition narratives. I'm trying to get out of the Jonathan narrative, but I'm not trying to get out of narratives in general.
Anyway, but it's obviously a high-level interpretive word, and it seems to me it's one that actually stretches well beyond the evidence, because you're calling it a sacrifice, but you're calling it a sacrifice because you've eliminated the power of your argument. Well, it can't be this, therefore it's a sacrifice. It's such a very weak style of an argument, right? I mean, if you want to call it a sacrifice, this is a sacrifice because this looks in the way that like other sacrifices look. Right? What we have here is something really...
No, we don't have very many.
Well, sacrifices, normally you have an altar, you have a temple, right? Actually, you don't usually have bones when you buy a sacrifice. Usually bones are very far from...
Oh, okay. Fine. I think it's deliberate.
So that part seems clear. It's laid out carefully. But there's, the use of bones to render something unfit for use, including sacrifice, has ample precedent in 2 Kings, where you've got the defiling, the high places were defiled by the
bring out the bones from the tombs and throw them there, and that takes care of it.
That doesn't look like a secret.
Exactly. So it's not a sacrifice, but it does have both an import, and maybe that's what, I'm not sure if you need it to be sacrificed.
I don't really, what I really needed to do is demonstrate that there are people other than the Maccabees up here. Because it happens after. So if you follow the text and you say, okay, Jonathan is a Seleucid official and he is up here doing his job, I can see that argument. There's a lot more to the story. And that lot more is so weighted and so freighted that it's not casual. And so that makes me load up on the import of the group responsible for this, whatever you call it. I'm much less invested in what it's called than I am invested in the idea that it reflects some actors who aren't in the story. Oh.
I have two questions. I guess they're both for you. So the first one is with the power struggle in the Seleucid Empire, doesn't that create the sort of instability that could that sort of lends that could enable an army of Jonathan's just to run up and down free, especially if he's acting on behalf of a king, whichever king that is. And the second thing is it's just from the text, it appears to me that Kadesh is simply a directional mark, sort of like, hey, they went as far as the stop sign. They encamped, they had the battle, and they came back. You know what I mean? So I'm not seeing where there's prolonged encampment, and I wondered if you could help me to see that.
No, you're right, there's no prolonged encampment, and there's no evidence that there is. Actually, there's no evidence of battle at the site at all. And I think that's a good way to put it. It seems like it's like a stop sign, right? To Kadesh in Galilee. That's right.
Why did he stop there? Why was that where he stopped?
Well, either it's because he really did stop there, because it's a Seleucid, right? Either it's true, and he stopped there because it's a Seleucid fortified spot, and that's where the army would have retreated to, or that's where there were stores. Right. Well, or the other is that Kadesh is actually it's a signal. Right. Like the text that you put in. Right. Because it's an important site in the biblical narrative. It's a city of refuge. It's a site. It's used to be Canaanite, conquered by the Israelites. It's the northern. It's an edge site for that. So it would have had these implications. Now, did it have those implications because all of those things really happened there? Or did some of those things happen there and then was it like Ai or Jericho, in the earlier biblical story? Just to say about the instability point that you raised, yes. Yes, I mean, Benedict's reconstruction absolutely makes sense with that, I would say.
Yeah, that is partly my argument. But just on this briefly, all these, this is a totally common phrase in those Maccabees. They went as far as, and they encamped, and then often they go somewhere else after that. And in this case, Jonathan just goes to Jerusalem again. So then you would have to, I think, explain. You would have to go through it. And all these passages. Actually, I did this first, and then I thought it was just too many. There was nothing in this sales thing that I can use. But you would have to do this and explain how every single time when they say they went as far as, they mean something specific. And the actual border between territory that is definitely out of Jonathan's reach is the river Eleutheros, right? Because that is in chapter 12 when he says, but he did not pursue them further because they had crossed the river Eleutheros. And that is, of course, far further up. So I would say this is really just, of course, but that was my argument, right? He just went there to Kadesh and stayed and one night and went away.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and just as a pick up on that before, my question, see, Eleutherius Riddle was also the ancient frontier in the 3rd century between the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic territories, so it's a sort of well-established kind of boundary line. My questions are, one to both of you, and one to Benedict. Benedict, one first. In your reconstruction, where Jonathan's or Simon's real opponent is Sarpedon, to what extent do you think Jonathan is acting as an agent of the Seleucid king? And to what extent does he have his own agenda? I'm really struck by how scholarship, especially at the moment, incorporating kind of local elites into the model of the Seleucid Empire, takes an imperial perspective and it sort of it aligns with the central power in its logics of understanding these processes. And so it wants to see, or it sees local, especially local non-Macedonian, non-Greek players as aligned with the interests of their kings. What is Jonathan's game there? Do you really think he is just sort of an appointee defending his patrons?
Although I am sure that he has his own agenda, and they do fortify cities where they can. They just cannot do it up there. But those were the purple stars. So of course, and if he really went to Rome, of course, I mean, this is a debated thing, but assuming he did, then of course he has his own agenda, sure. I also don't think that there is, I mean, I agree with this point that we sometimes naturally maybe tend to view it from the imperial perspective, but of course, what really is the imperial perspective here? Is it Demetrius' perspective? Is it Phaeton's perspective? You know, the empire is already in dissolution at that point. It's not just in 129. So what empire even means at that stage is very, it's a complicated thing. Also, for example, what does it mean that Tyre consistently makes coins for Demetrius, right? How much control does he have over the city because they make coins with his image? Yeah, I would not deny that he has an agenda, not at all. But I think that as a first of all, I think it's very clear that the first Maccabees consistently portrays him as a Seleucid agent, right? He goes there because he has his office. That is how I read this text. And of course, you can ask why do they so belittle him in a way? But then that it comes in what I said earlier this morning. This is a text of Hyrcanus and of the Simon line, not of Jonathan. They can afford to belittle Jonathan. Actually, it is very good for their own agenda, or for the agenda of this text. And this is why I think in this case we are in the lucky position. Maybe that would be my counter argument. I think the Jonathan parts are the best parts of the book, because that is one part where you can just narrate what actually happened according to historical records, whatever. Because it didn't, it was not a problem. It was good. Of course, you don't want Jonathan to look bad or so, but it was also not as the picture of Simon. And with Simon, the problems come again, because I don't really see how Simon's status is so different from Jonathan. He also doesn't win points, for example.
That's right.
Then of course they do the staking thing, but he is still in contact then with Antiochus VII, who suddenly wants cities back from him and so on. So his status has not really changed, but First Maccabees claims it did. So I think there is a lot of lying and cheating in the chapters before Jonathan and after Jonathan. But the Jonathan narrative is a peaceful island of historical truth.
A peaceful island of historical truth. Scott.
Going kind of along that line of trying to understand what's different talking about what's different in Maccabees between talking about Jonathan and talking about Simon, and then going back to your point about how there's kind of a minimalized narrative in these discussions of where Jonathan goes versus Glenn, your example before about the First Kings and Chronicles, and how there is more of a value statement talked about. My question is kind of about literature about borders in general and how that kind of continually gets contested and talked about in vague terms. Is there a sense that even if you're giving a minimalist narrative about borders, is there other precedents for filling in information in this way that maybe even Maccabees doesn't have to talk so much about what happened at these traditional border sites, but that the audience would be expected to fill in the information in a way that would be counter to the archaeological narrative, as it seems to be in the case of the way that Maccabees is traditionally interpreted and the way that Jonathan is traditionally interpreted, even though that's not how you're saying that the text should literally be read. But there's something to me that seems about border literature that inspires this.
Scott, let me take the liberty of calling on Professor Weitzman, who has written beautifully, and you know because you read the article, on the fictionality of borders and the use of narrative to construct them. So narrative strategy in the construction of borders.
In some ways, the work I've done on borders makes me not qualified to write about this because or talk about this because what is a border in this period of time? And we were talking about what I wrote about borders was in a much earlier period, and
but the impulse and the need is not. I mean, the borders haven't gone away.
But my question is, I mean, this is a genuine open question. What is a border? I mean, I think that when we think of borders, we think of lines in territory that are defined by some centralized authority. That a state defines itself by its activity at the border and invests a lot of its energy in controlling what happens at the border and across that border. Is that what a border is in this context? Or is a border something, I mean, in a sense, later on in the Hasmonean kingdom, the Hasmoneans change their borders by changing the people who live on those borders, by forcibly converting the Idumeans and others. So for them, the border is not about territory, it's about the loyalty of the people who live in a certain region, and they effectively change that border by changing the allegiance of the people who live in that territory. So, I mean, what is a border?
Well,
what I would ask in response to that is that this fluidity of borders, is that emblematic of what we're kind of seeing in this contestation of these sites, or does that contribute to the way in which narratives can be written about them, in terms of how much information people can give, or like, I guess my immediate thought is when looking at archaeology, if we see different materials in a site like Kedish over time, or we see it at disappearance of materials, does that tell us that people are coming in a fixed way and leaving in a fixed way, or does it say that this is kind of like an open, fluid area, so much so that it would alter the way that it's being written about? If that makes sense.
This is another question I have, which is somewhat like, so, a lot of city-states in West Asia, they're boasting that they have sacred and inviolable status. So, as if they have some status that prevents them from being violated by external sources. So, but that is something I associate with cities or with temples.
Right.
Is that a claim of border? I mean, is that what it means to assert a border in this context? That beyond a certain line, within a certain territory, this is sacred and inviolable, and you are not sanctioned by the gods to enter here?
I think that your question is a huge and important one, Scott. It would be fantastic to have to look carefully at the way that the author of First Maccabees, and then actually following him, Josephus, who uses the text but who knows what happened afterwards, uses sites, regions, and people to construct an in and an out. I take it in a way that that's your question.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if there is some pattern that can be read into the Matthias versus Jonathan versus Simon alternation of how much detail is given, but I really think literally there has to be something there, maybe this is a way to kind of make a small entry into that question.
Yeah, because there are very large implications to the question,
Right.
which is, and this was the topic that Cattell talked about actually in the very first Maccabees project dialogue that we had, which is, did they have a concept of the promised land? Did they have a concept of that land that they were then looking to instantiate? And if they did, what was it and where did they get it?
First Maccabees does accept this idea of nations roundabout, and it doesn't seem to problematize that. It seems to know exactly what it's talking about. And these are invariably hostile.
But so that's construction of the outside and the inside. So in effect, it's a construction of the border. And then a larger question that would be related to that I think, and then I'm going to call on Yonder, is what are the implications of the answer to that question for the other ways that you read the narrative? How do those different vectors?
I love that question. I think it's very specific, and it gives it responses that we have in this context, in which we assume that borders are as fixed as lines that we can see on the road that we're walking on. And I think we carry the impression that we have of these fixed borders in our own context into the text. We assume that when a region is described or referred to, it's encircled by sort of like map lines in the minds of the authors. But those distant borders where you're not standing seem to be mentioned in ways that are much more evocative than they are sort of legal. They press on the anxieties of about vulnerability, about invasion, about outsiders. And it seems like, I wonder if what goes on with borders is these points at which anxieties become fears is also sort of happening with all the facts. That is to say that the stories are narrated in a way that's more intended to be evocative, to consolidate identity, consolidate authority, but not necessarily to accomplish any kind of record keeping for any way that we might.
Well, that brings us all the way back to the question that Steve initially posed, which is how do you stand in the story? And what do you gain by investing in it, and what do you lose by undermining it?
I have a question. Most of my training was from Steve and his colleagues in the religious studies department. I didn't actually take any courses from an archaeologist, and it's interesting to hear the way you approach it versus the way Steve might. And I'm wondering if you collect, let's say you go out and you collect data, from digs or whatever, and you have a bunch of data points. I think that consciously or unconsciously, you want to create a full narrative.
You are right, sir.
That's what we want to do.
Yeah.
And I feel like, whereas if you're starting from the text, you're starting with the biblical text, I felt like it was more of a pruning and a corrective process, if that's what you're trying to do. I mean, my interest in ancient texts has always been, how can we understand the minds of these people from antiquity? And that's why I went into psychiatry. And it's a similar kind of a thing. Other people are more interested in asking the question of what actually happened. But if you're asking the question of what happened, it seems like you're getting a very finite amount of data, and then in your mind you're creating a story. So what's your corrective process? I mean, you clearly are compelled to create a full narrative with no holes, but how do you correct for all the things that you're unconsciously wanting to put into that narrative that may not be there? If you're going from just the archaeological facts, then there's this whole other complication of you're using the Bible as well. You're not just kind of looking at it as a tabula rasa. I'm guessing that's never been done, because you're going to read the Bible and you're going to have an idea in your mind of what the Bible says as well. So it seems like a very complicated process, and it seems very anxiety-provoking, because you want to know what happened with such little data.
I don't think I think that's a fantastic question, and it's a very insightful one, and I'm going to try to answer it, and then I think we're going to draw to a close because it's going to be 8 o'clock, and I'll try to do it pretty quickly and say, we don't, any of us as scholars, come to the things that we investigate neutrally. We're invested, just in the way that you framed it when you started. We're invested somehow or another. Some things strike us as more interesting or compelling than other things. I mean, on its own, source criticism of 2nd century BC Hellenistic historians and biblical writers doesn't, grab everybody. So there has to be some, and I'm invested. You're right that I'm invested in wanting to know what happened, and I want a story, and the vector to which I get to it is material remains and not sources. But I'm not interested in that everywhere. I'm not interested so much in Inuit legends and Inuit archaeology. And the thing that I find compelling and what makes it worth it to sit around for a couple of hours and noodle about one decade in the middle of the 2nd century BC in a little plot of land far on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean is that what happened there was done by people who relied on some big stories, thought those big stories mattered to them, wrote other stories, narratives, histories, that then other people relied on, building out and out in a series of concentric circles that eventually encompassed me too. I was raised in that tradition. I was taught it was true. I grew up to find out exactly as Steve said. It wasn't quite like that. I'm invested in the whole construction, not what happened just baldly on the ground, but how what happened and what people wrote about and how people used what other people wrote about and how some of it affected what happened to lots of other people lots of later. I'm interested in that whole complicated dynamic. And the way that I can get to it is by pulling on one certain thread, and that's the thread of the material remains, and then subjecting it to the scrutiny of people like Benedict and Steve and other people in this room, and then hoping together that we'll get a little bit more of a handle on how it worked, because how that worked matters to a lot of people now. Me too.
That, I guess the reason why I asked the question is because that question of the sacrifice, clearly that means a lot to you. That scenario, whatever happened there, means a lot to you. And you feel very compelled to come up with a full narrative of what happened. Whereas maybe in the other corner of the room, you were less compelled to find a narrative for that corner. And why is, where is that coming from within you is very interesting to me. because you could have drawn the line a little bit before, and like you said, instead of calling it a sacrifice, call it something else. But you wanted to call it that for a reason.
Yeah, I better stop using that word. That really gets. I'm going to think about what you said, and maybe I'm going to stop using that word. Paul, you want to go through?
Yeah. So the problem of historicity in one Maccabees has come up over and over again, and I was really struck by your comparison with Chronicles at the beginning. We all see the invention of Chronicles, but that's dealing with essentially half a millennium earlier than the writing of that book. And in Maccabees, we're dealing with like the Second World War starts.
Yes.
At the maximum.
That's right.
And that's also perhaps like the Second World War. It's a world in which the audience, and perhaps the author too, is engaging with families who have their own traditions, who celebrate the heroism of their fathers on particular battlefields. And so I just wonder about the difficulties of making things up in historic record sources, and to sort of widen that. Do you think, this is a question to the three of you, do you think there are sources which are flowing into First Maccabees? Are there, where does it get its information from? Because it's incredibly detailed. narrative and connect it to that. It's a narrative which is
Benedict's
also
book, right?
it's in a classicizing style. It's in Hebrew, which is it's bizarre to me that it's not in Greek. It's a classicizing style, and it contains archaizing violence. At the same time, it's, as Benedict is saying, it's insisting on the Seleucid identity of these players, and if there is any contradiction there.
I am not equipped to answer that question.
Well, I am equipped because I have the book by Klaus Dietrich Schunk, Die Quellen des Ersten und Zweiten Maccabees, in 1954. So that, of course, you could read, and then you know how not to do it, because this is the worst of German source criticism, because it is very bad when it is then done by no offense, but by a theologian who is not properly equipped doing this, really. So, of course, you can describe every unit in the text to this or that source. I don't think that it works that way. If you believe that the decree for Simon is authentic, which I think is mostly accepted, then there you have at least one source. There is reference to another one at the end. It is on John Hyrcanus, of course, but there is that one. There may have been earlier ones for others. It works similarly, by the way, in Chronicles, of course, with the and further it is written there and actually in the same wording. Now, the date of Chronicles, we will not get into them, so I think there is some solid information. It just varies how much is taken over. Of course, one traditional argument is that it is all somehow based on Jason of Cyrene. So then that's what he does. He compares it with second Maccabees, and then you find the common source, and then you find the deviations. Maybe not, but clearly there is some parallel material in first and second Maccabees. It's not all made up. No way. Some things are, I think. Like Mattathias, maybe. Yeah, I don't want to push that too far. The whole Hellenizing reform was almost completely made up in that version. And then, the Seleucid aspect is kept alive for Jonathan, less so for Simon, for reasons. There you see the tendency. So, I would say there's a contradiction in that, because even Hyrcanus, the anchor remains on the point, right? The Seleucid context never goes away. So there was a big garble, but I was just so because the sources thing is an important one. Yeah, and I generally have a rather high appreciation for the historicity of most of the actual events that are like. I always believe that there was something. It may have been told in a way that makes it difficult to see what was actually there, but especially these administrative things, they are also quite boring, right? So there is, I don't see much of a tendency in these chapters 9 to 12. Because,
what was your phrase? What was the phrase?
What, that is boring?
An island of...
Oh, yeah. A peaceful island of historical truth, yeah.
A peaceful island of historical truth. Just because write that on the top of your copy. That is very nice. A peaceful island of historical truth. I'm going to draw this to a close, and thank you all very much for bringing your attention and your energy and your presence to this conversation. Aspects of this conversation and others will continue tomorrow morning on the second floor, 147 Bay State Road at the Elie Wiesel Center in the library. Oh, thank you. Thank you.